Okay, class 6 is really going to be dealing with levels and loudness, okay? And one of the things that we're going to really go over is the metering and metering technology, okay? And there's lots of different types of meters, and there are two basic styles of meters. You got like RMS metering, like root mean square metering, or where you're basically dealing with loudness metering, so average loudness. And so a meter like that will show much lower audio level, right, than will many of the other, forms of metering, like peak metering, which will show the instantaneous transient peaks. That's very important because that's going to show you where your peak signals are and if you're clipping. Whereas an RMS meter may be sitting around -18 or -20 and be nowhere near zero and give you no indication whatsoever that you're clipping. But the peak meter will show you that you're clipping, right? So when you actually look at a mastering application, it'll come with at least one meter, right? Like even this right here, and we'll just bring down the gain all the way. So actually, this won't show anything, right? So you can see here that there is some right. So you'll see some metering here. It'll show multiple things, or it'll show peak levels and RMS, and that's actually just the two options that they have here. So you can kind of overlay them, and you'll see two different layers of coloring on them. When you actually get to other things here, you'll start to get like one of the most common metering that's used actually in physical form of the dural meters, right? And they're very powerful meters, right? So these different metering technologies, they have different shapes. You could see it sideways. You could see it sort of like this with the separation of left and right. You can have your peak signals, set settings for them individually, so your peaks can be held, et cetera, things like that. You could show, it could display overs, right? So you want to see those types of things. You could have it show phase differential, sum and difference. So this would be mid and side signal, left and right. So there's lots of different options that you have with the different meters, but they'll primarily show two basic things. And those two basic things will be your average level and your peak level, right? Those are the two primary metering technologies that you're working with. And there's lots of newer metering tech. There's a whole thing about the K system that's been going on that sort of develops from the film industry. In the film industry, when they work, they set the volume to a fixed level, and they make their mix, so they don't really adjust the volume level, right, when they're mixing. They leave it set for whatever it is, because in a theater, when you're in a theater, there is a volume control, but you don't have control over it. So whatever the volume is set by the movie theater, that's what it is, whatever volume they determine. And then you mix accordingly, right? So they'll have meters in there showing the SPL level from their mix position, and they will mix signals up, and they'll get that meter to show a certain decibel level to match the actual physical level that they have on their volume pot. Right, so the volume pot will have different settings of like 83 dB, 85 dB, etc., as opposed to just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, like a normal volume pot would have, right? And the K system was sort of a way of trying to emulate that or kind of bring that technology in. So really what they're trying to do with these things is try to more accurately define this idea of perceived loudness. Okay, so there's a difference between perceived loudness and actual loudness, right? Or actual, level, right? So a peak meter, you may have one instantaneous peak that's 12 dB above the average sound level or the rest of the audio. And that one peak can prevent you from bringing your overall gain up higher. So the whole idea is that you meter it, right? You figure out where those peaks are, and then you start to apply limiting technology, right? So if you can actually take a peak that happens that occurs within like a couple of milliseconds, you can limit it, almost cleanly cut it off without it being perceptible, right? Just clip it right off, right, without it being perceptible. And then as you start to go down lower, right, and bring your gain overall up, that's where you start to have more issues, right? So the lower that you go, the more that peak limiting starts to kick in, right? If you start to grab some of the lower peak signals, then you start to have more of a problem. So all the processing leading up to this place, particularly the compression technology that we talked about, is really about getting that gain sort of maximized and really working on the perceived loudness as much as you can right up till you get to the limiting stage, right? And then you start maximizing the output gains. And so that's a real critical step, right, in the process, right? So if you get everything set kind of well along the way there, along the road there, then you can apply this limiting technology at the end and maximize your overall output gain, right? So here, we may apply like a multiband limiter technology, like the LL3, right? And so here we have 5 bands to work with, and we can prioritize the individual bands so that we can, if a certain frequency area is more important, right, in terms of the gain or the clarity, we can leave that alone, make that a higher priority so less gain reduction happens within that particular band. If all of the activity of peaks happens within a particular band, you can focus it more in that area, right? And so the limiting happens just within the frequency band area, or mostly, and the other bands are left less affected. So the idea is to try to do this technology in as transparent a way as possible for as long as you can, so that every step along the way, we're adding to the density and to the clarity, to the focus, to the perceived loudness, all the way through, step by step, through the whole process, until we get to the final mix stage, right? And that way we minimize what we have to do, because otherwise you could just grab the threshold here and crank it down, and you could end up with all kinds of attenuation here and also a whole lot of distortion, right? So, that's what we're trying to avoid here with the mastering process. So, in terms of kind of keeping these sort of Hippocratic oath, like do no harm, in terms of the mastering process, you have to kind of prepare everything along the way so that at no stage in the process do you overdo something, right? So in other words, I would rather have 8 plugins mastering a single song, each one of those things doing their own little surgical thing that helps to add to this effect of perceived loudness, so that at the very end, when I'm maximizing my gain, right, I can do so as transparently as possible, get the output that I'm looking for, and not have it be so affected, right? So does that make sense? Does that make sense? So perceived loudness, right? It's really like a funny thing, because a lot of it has to do with frequencies, right? There are certain frequency areas that we are exaggerated, like 2 to 6K. We have more focus in that area because that's a lot of the articulation of the voice. We have more focus or more energy, in the mid-range frequencies. When we start to go lower in frequency and higher in frequency, super high in frequency, then our loudness, that takes away from the loudness, right? We don't perceive it as well. So you could have 110 dB of sub-frequencies going on, right? Meter it and everything, and the rest of the mix happening, and it won't really sound any louder than when you take it out. Maybe a little bit, right? But if you apply 110 dB from like 200 cycles up to 5K, it's going to be extremely loud, right? It's going to be extremely loud in that frequency range, right? So there's a balance there where we're more sensitive, right? Where does that frequency content occur? Right, and that gives us some sense of perceived loudness. Now, that's not the whole picture, because in any given mix, the more instrumentation that you have in that mix, the more dense and louder it may appear, right, depending upon the mix, right? And so much of this perception of loudness has to do with size and the 3D sound field. If the sound is between the speakers, right, to get the same perceived loudness as something that is escaping the speakers, going below them, above them, behind them, in front of them, and out to the side, that mix that's stuck between the speakers will not sound as loud as that bigger mix, even though it will meter at a higher volume, right? So there's that same intangible, right, that exists that you can't always define by frequency, right? So when we work with this depth and imaging and openness, right, we're helping to usher in all of that as well, right, to help make all of that work, right? Does that sound cool? Right? Does that make sense? So this way, as we're working along, just like the mix process, right, we can get as much of that perceived loudness. And that's all you really care about, right? You care about the person's ability to hear the detail and definition of the individual instruments. And then if you happen to maximize that, right, and you happen to do some limiting technology, right, and you go from the bottom up, right, so you're not really affecting the peaks on the top, right, then what you're doing is you're bringing in more presence and more detail. And then that limits how far you have to pull the bottom down, right? That's like really like a real, big part of how this whole thing works. So we'll get into a bunch of metering stuff with this as well, right? And we'll get into how you use, the different compression techniques to get loudness, right? And brick wall limiters and multiband peak limiting, okay? And, there are some positives and negatives for maximizing gain, right? And you have to be very appropriate to the style of music that you're working with, okay? And most critically, what format is it being released for? So a lot of the work that I did was a lot of radio single work, right? So I do radio singles, right? And that's a different style of mixing than would be done for a CD release, okay? Because with the CD release, back then at least, you could assume that it's more likely that the person is going to be listening to this in their home environment, all right? And listening to it between a pair of speakers or listening to it with headphones of reasonable quality. So, right, so preserving more of the dynamic range is critical. If I know that I'm sending a mix out to a radio station that's going to limit it by 80 to 1, then I'm going to have to pre-compress my audio. I'm going to have to make that mix so solid, right, that 80 to 1 limiter bounces right off of it, right? My mix holds together. So if I leave my dynamic range in my mix all loosey-goosey, and then I throw it into that 80 to 1 limiter, it's like going to be going into a car crusher, and it's going to destroy the balances in the mix, and it's going to destroy the detail of the mix, and it's going to come out sounding awful. If I can control all of my individual compression along the way and kind of tighten things up so everything has the feel and the sense that it's very dynamic and alive, even though it's very compressed, then when it goes through that compressor, it's going to limit it and bring it down, but the effect is going to be not nearly as much, right? So that's the basic idea, right? That's the basic idea there, right? And that's kind of all about class 6. This is a really important class 6, right? All about loudness, right? Levels and loudness, okay?